Good morning, dearest friends. Today is Thursday, September 2nd, Elul, the 25th of Elul, Chafei Elul. We're studying the Talmud, the whole Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Presently, Meseches Shabbos, Perek Shvi'i, Klal Perek, Klal Gadol, on 74b. And in just a moment, we'll turn the page to 75a. Before we jump into the Gemara, today is a special day. Every day special, but today is the 25th of Elul. And according to at least one of the traditions of the Talmud, and it's the tradition that we follow certainly in our calculation of years, this would be the day of creation. As we know, Hashem creates the world in 6 days. On the seventh day, he rests. The first day of creation, that would be the 25th of Elul. The sixth day of creation, the day that man was created, that would be Rosh Hashanah, and that will be celebrating with Hashem's help Monday night and Tuesday and Wednesday. And so we're getting in the zone. We're almost there. And it's special that we're preparing for Rosh Hashanah in the very best way possible with the study of Gemara, Torah. They can't really think of a better way to prepare. As you may recall, we're presently analyzing the second Mishnah in the chapter Perek Klal Gadol, where we have listed 39 different melachos, and we've been going step by step, analyzing, discussing, interpreting, expanding, or narrowing the definitions and the parameters of those melachos. Yesterday, we closed out a unit, if you will, although you can never really close these units, and throughout the Gemara, we'll keep on referring to all of these melachos, of course, but we've finished analyzing the segment of the Mishnah, which we described as Sidura de Pas, the process to bake bread. It's not so simple, as we've discovered. And now we are in the textile material garment segment. And preparing garments too is not quite as simple as going to the mall. We started yesterday talking about how those fibers are initially taken from a sheep in a step called goizes, shearing. And then we have melabain, whitening or cleaning, menapates, combing, and then tuvia, spinning. And we kind of glossed over those steps. I suppose they are somewhat straightforward. There will be additional discussions, though, of course, throughout our Gemara. And we talked yesterday, just to remind you, the closing conversation was about these very skilled women in the time of the Mishkan who figured out, and it must have been a kunz, a trick, maybe it was higher quality, but they would actually spin the hair of the goats to create those materials that were made of goat's hair while on the body of the goat. But as Rav Kana says, that's not typical. It was so unique that it only was applied at a time where there was 600,000 households, millions of people, and they found a few people that had this unique talent. That's not the common method, and therefore, according to the second opinion there, according to Rav Kana, were one to spin hair of a sheep or a goat while on the animal's body, that would not count as conventional malacha of tuvia. We go out on a limb and say you shouldn't do it. As a matter of fact, you should probably not do it in general, even in a weekday. I don't imagine that's either safe for you or kind for the animal. But that's, again, for this Gemara, we're talking from the perspective, from the vantage point of Shabbos.
As far as braiding your hair?
I'm sorry?
Does that have an effect of whether it's okay to braid your hair on Shabbos?
So it's an interesting question. I don't want to go long on the topic just because I don't have a lot of source material at this very moment. But I will say that we are the halachic works, the Shulchan Aruch and the like, talk about plucking a hair, shaving, or all those things could be an extension of some of malachis. In due course, we'll perhaps discuss more. But you'll see in a moment, not exactly the discussion on humans, but we'll see how there are other restrictions as it comes to removing hair and other parts of the body, whether it's kotzets or goizes.
I guess the knots and all.
So then the question becomes, and again, I want to have the source material in front of me before discussing it. I like to be text-based, but it goes into a good question. Is there a scenario where braiding is acceptable? Is combing acceptable? Is brushing acceptable? I don't want to do it now on one foot. When the Gemara addresses it, we'll pull out the corresponding halachic works, and we'll discuss. Just give me another second. Hang on. And we'll address it, Mirza Hashem, in due course. Let's jump into the Gemara. And Professor, it's good to have you on. We missed you. Welcome back. So we're going to share the screen and we'll get started. Here is our Gemara. Oh, I should say, while I find the place, that most of yesterday was dominated by our construction projects that were compound malachas, creating a barrel out of earthenware could be up to 7 malachas, an oven up to 8 malachas, a reed basket woven, we said up to 11 malachas, maybe even up to 12 or 13. And so we're talking about compound malachas, a single arts and crafts project that could be quite problematic if it's done on Shabbos. We had some fun looking at some of the different commentaries that had different counts of those malachas. We had a chance to discuss how, depending on how you define makeh b'patish, would depend if makeh b'patish belongs. Is the malacha of boina a problem? Rashi says that there is no such thing as boina with kalim, and Tosfos disagrees. And now that I think of it, when we had the Gemara about the put together, the plugged together beds, as our doctor reminded us, and the menorahs, the candelabras. So I believe Rashi and Tosfos had a similar discussion then. And here we see another practical application. Well, practical. It has to do with the development of our app. So anyways, let's go into the Gemara. Tana Rabbana. Actually, let's open the commentaries and let's also change the format to be, all right, here we go. Tana Rabbana. Hatoileish es hakanaf. If a person plucks out a kanaf, so we usually think of kanaf as wing, but here we're talking about the large feathers. Rashi says, "Noitza gedolim in kanaf ha'oif." We're talking about the feathers of the wings. So although kanaf in Hebrew, Dr. Stalmer, right, kanaf would be either a corner of a garment or kanfei nisharim, kanfei no yonah. That usually is a reference to the wing, not to a specific feather. But Rashi makes it clear here we're talking about plucking a feather. The koimtoi, and if one snips, says Rabbi Steinsaltz, snips the tip of the feather. No, I'm sorry. Vehamortoi, one who snips it. Let's do this again.
No.
If you pluck the.
Lektom is to just cut up the top, and moto is to pluck the.
Wouldn't kotmo usually mean to bend? But anyways, in this context, we're talking about.
As far as I know, usually means to they cut off the tip.
So I have good news. Rashi agrees with you, Doctor. Hakoim tmoi. Now that the feather is removed, we trim the end of it, head of it, shehudak, which is somewhat more pointy, fine. And now that it is less pointy, it would work better in a bed or in bedding, let us say like that. And if one, I'm going to read Rabbi Steinsaltz here. You pull out the thin threads. Oh, I guess you strip off the individual little strands of a feather. What do you call those? What is the scientific? What's the word for those the feather? Anyways, if you smooth out or make it more even by removing some of the pieces of the feather, chayiv shalosh chatos. A person does these 3 acts, they will have done 3 separate melachas. Actually, let's see Rashi Vamartai. You can strip off some of those fibers, hairs from each side. He says, sometimes a feather, the central part of it, the part that we might use for a quill if we're going to be in that industry, the spine of the feather is hard. And so you don't want that in your bedding. So you might strip off the soft parts of the feather and remove the spine to be more desirable, more comfortable for your bedding. So if you do these 3 steps, and Rashi again sees it all in the context, Rashi imagining why you'd want to do those things, has it in the context of creating bedding. So you would have done 3 separate malachas. Although you might think 3 acts of manipulating, of preparing, of accessing a feather. You might think it's a single malacha, but each of these 3 steps actually fill out and check 3 different malacha categories. What are they? Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish specifies toilesh, the plucking, chayiv mishum goizek. That would be akin to shearing, to the removing of the usable, valuable fiber or wool in the case of an animal. So by plucking the feather, that is part of the subcategory of goizes of shearing. On a wool, you shear it. On a bird, you pluck it. And so it's ultimately considered part of the same concept of the method of acquiring the animal's stuff that it has to contribute. Koitain, the snipping, chayiv mishum echatech. Well, that is cutting, and it's also cutting with precision. Rashi, why is it cutting with precision? The kapid lachtoich ad makom shuroi. You cut it exactly where it's going to now be functional. So there's a precise amount of cutting. And then he says, oh, FYI, by the way, don't think that you don't desire to have what Dr. Stamler described as the spine. That spine, the hard part that you don't want in your bedding, well, that has another function that goes well in woven stuff. For example, there's certain kinds of hats. I'm not exactly envisioning it, but suffice it to say, I guess it could be done, and it is done, says Rashi. So plucking is shearing. Snipping is cutting with precision. Mimaret, the stripping of the fluffy part of the fuzzy part of the feather. Chayiv mishum memachet, this is akin to smoothing. Let's see Rashi. No, Rashi doesn't say. I guess because just like smoothing of the leather is to make the leather comfortable and functional for a garment or for whatever its purpose is, well, stripping these fibers, the fluffy, comfy part of the feather is essentially the same idea. You would look at a snapshot of an alien from outer space or a beginner who's just being introduced to the Gemara, which in a sense all of us are, which hopefully will always keep the perspective of a beginner because that helps us appreciate what we're learning. So although the snapshot is very different to see a person working with a tool to smooth out leather and a person trimming or stripping the fluffy, soft part of a feather, the picture is very different, but the concept is very much the same. We're taking the part of the animal byproduct that's desirable and comfortable, and we're rejecting or putting aside or eliminating the part that is undesirable. And therefore, in that sense, says Reish Lakish, that 3 acts, all to procure the fluffy part of the dawn, the part of the feather that's going to be good in your bedding, but it's considered 3 different malachos. I suppose we will. Well, let's just see one thing. See, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't bring this, but let's see the Rambam. Let's read this just to have somewhat of a picture. Hagoizes. Oh, I'm sorry, I did it again. When I do it from this computer, we try to make it a larger font size. There we go. Okay. All right, should be better. All right, this is still small, so let's see if we can make this font size bigger too. No, we can't. All right, Hagozei semer osei armin bein min abehema bein min achai bein min achai bein min ames afilu min ashalach shalem chai. If you strip wool or hair from any kind of animal, living or no longer alive, it's considered goizes. Kamashiri, how much fiber needs to be stripped to be considered a malacha? Basically, a small amount that you can make a functional, small amount of wool or thread. He gives them dimensions. Then the Rambam goes on to quote our Gemara. Well, he's not quoting our Gemara, but he's putting our Gemara into halachic terms. If you pluck he uses the same word kanaf. You see that? He doesn't translate it, but kanaf we'll keep as a feather, a wing feather, which is, I guess, the ideal high-grade, expensive feathers of a bird. Hareza told us, guys, that's considered shearing. You see, he doesn't mention the other steps over here. He says if you spin the wool on a living animal while it's on the animal, that's not considered typical conventional ways of doing it. Now, you see, okay, let me explain something. The way the Rambam organizes his work of Mishnah Torah is to be very organized, very systematic. And so he goes through the different malachas. And so actually here we get to see a little bit of the godless of the Rambam. The Rambam is going by malacha by malacha. So here he's talking about geizes. And so he only talks about the component of the feather that belongs in geizes. Now let's see the next, it's not the next, but let's see the halacha of the Rambam that describes mafshit skinning. So he says like this, if you split the hide in two, because the way hide works is the hide itself can be split, and there's the part of the hide that's on the inside, and there's a part of the hide that's on the outside. So he says that's actually considered a byproduct of skinning. If you jump or beat or work the hide, the way I think we're talking about Rabbi Menachem, Ratzonim, what are we talking about? We're talking about anyways, the people, you're muted.
Yeah.
I just muted you again. I'm sorry. You have to unmute. I'm sorry.
With strips of leather.
These are the tanners, right? Or the leather processors.
Sakai is the tanner.
Ratzonim are the people that make the leather that's going to be in different marketable or functional.
It comes from the word retzua.
The people,
strip of leather.
Right. The people who prepare the leather to be functional. So that's ma'abed. Ma'abed is another one of the malachas that we didn't mention in this mission. Now, if you strip off the noitza, the down, the fluffy part of the feather, this is considered like smoothing. And similarly with other materials, by you smoothing them out, that's like the process of smoothing the leather. So Rashi here puts in another entire section the other step of the feather. And then lastly, we have another halacha here, the following halacha that says, if you cut leather into precise strips, again, this is old news, it's interesting to look in the Rambam. If you have a specific amount of leather that you want, Rabbi Menachem, I imagine the Ratzonim who are preparing the leather and then probably sending it to the retail, they also probably do this. If you randomly cut without precision, without intention,
it's probably used in making tefillin.
Tefillin, shoes, lahavdil shoes, belts, purses, right? All different kinds of things. Then he says, if you cut it randomly without precision, then you may have other problems on your hands, but this would not be considered choitech or mechatech, because cutting has to be with precision. Then he says, like choitem is like kanaf, you trim, you snip the feather, then you've also done mechatech, because as our Gemara explained, as Rashi explained, you have precision. So suffice it to say, just to understand a little bit how the Rambam works. He takes this Gemara, he brings it down halachically, halacha l'maisa, but he's very organized, and therefore each item is separated into a separate space in his laws of Shabbos. The Gemara here is talking the subject of feathers, and it's teaching us a chiddush, has three different malachas, and the Rambam understands it and implements that into his halachic work. All right, that concludes this interesting discussion of feathers. We're now going to understand. Remember the picture that I posted? I don't have it on my computer anymore. We posted the picture with the Hasidic, with the guy with the shtreimel and the Shabbos bekasha doing the malachas. So we're going to understand now why, when he was talking about kosher tying, he drew a picture or provided a picture of a net, unlike what was proposed as we read the Mishnah, that it was used in tying the urios, the hides and the skins and the walls of the Mishkan to the pecs. So we'll see now. Kosher v'amatir. Additional malachas that are prohibited on Shabbos is kosher and matir, tying and untying. As we know, you're not allowed to tie certain kinds of knots, and you're not allowed to untie certain kinds of knots. So the Gemara is not challenging that you can't tie knots. And when we studied it in the Mishnah, we discussed, of course, there are non-permanent knots, which are not considered halachically knots. This would be a good time to have a sailor with us to talk about different kinds of knots, but we'll leave it for now. We'll keep it in a more simple base. Kishira b'mishkan heicha hava. You're telling me that they're malachas. Now we know every malacha needs to be present in the mishkan. Where was tying? I'll remind you, the kohanim were barefoot, so they weren't tying their shoelaces. I'm not sure if they had. Well, they had. Anyways, okay. So let's see. Amar Rava. So Rava gives an initial proposal. Sheken koishrim the yeseidos ayalum. When they were constructing the Mishkan, the material that made the walls and the roof had to be tied with pegs. So the Gemara says, Koishrim, is this an authentic, accurate depiction of Keshira, of tying, that's counted as one of the malachis? The Gemara asks the question, Aho Koisher Almanas Lahaterhu. This is a temporary knot. Let's read Rashi now. You say this oil. Noyatzim Yeseidos Bekarka. But this is probably something we're familiar with, but Rashi explains that what they would do is they would place pegs in the ground. And indeed, the pasuk supports this. That the Mishkan had pegs. And then they would tie on the materials that created the walls and the roof of the Mishkan. Now, why is this not a good instance of tying? Rashi says, the Gemara says, this is a kind of temporary knot. Rashi, v'chihai gavna patrinon le'lekama. This type of knot, the Gemara later on is going to teach us, is not considered a knot. The Tanan, the Mishnah later will teach us, which is why, again, we need to remember this Mishnah that we read with 39 malachis. This is just the intro to the rest of our Masechta. But there's a Mishnah that says, Ko kesher she'eino yishel kayama, a knot, which is not a long-term, meant to last. Ein chayavin olav, one would not be considered liable for the desecration of Shabbos by tying a knot, which is why people are allowed to tie their shoes on Shabbos. Again, not halacha l'maaseh. Are there ways that you shouldn't tie knots? We'll get there at length in due course, but just to understand that not every knot is considered a knot, that's a malacha. So if that's the case, if a temporary knot, which we know it's temporary because the Mishkan whole existence was temporary, it was put together and taken down, as the Torah tells us, even on one day, the Mishkan could be assembled and disassembled. So it is certainly considered what we would call a temporary knot, not a true knot. Again, that's why I said if we had a sailors here, we'd have a hard time or an easy time talking about different kinds of knots and how often they're untied, etc. So Rava proposes that it's the tying down of the materials of the walls, and the Gemara says no, that can't be it. Ela Amar Abaya. So now Abaya is going to propose an alternate instance where tying was necessary in the Mishkan. Shekin arge yiriyos shenifsaka lahenet nima. Those who engaged in the weaving of the materials that became the Mishkan's material. What happens if a strand snapped? So they would then retie it. Omar le Rava. Rava responds and says, Tiratz the kosher. Now we have the instance of time. Matir ma'ikol meimar. Such a kind of tying where a string breaks and we choose to tie together to repair, that never happens. So what is our instance of untying? Maybe you'll say like this. Maybe here is the instance in the tabernacle and the Mishkan of untying. What if when you tie them together, you got it wrong? So now shori chad v'koter chad, you have to untie it and retie it. Slingmar says that doesn't sound right. Hashta, if the melech basav v'damei noisin came, this kind of sloppy work would not be appropriate even before a human king. Sorry, hold on. Lifnei melech malchem lach makadosh baruch hu oisin. You think we're going to do sloppier work for Hashem? Elo amar Rava v'yitem Rav Eloi. So a third proposal is suggested and accepted. Shekein sidei or tzadei chilazain koishrim umatkirim. Indeed, those who would trap the chilazon, the creature which provides the pigment for techeles, which is the blue that was used as pigment in the base in the Mishkan and is used as the techeles of tzitzis. Those trappers would make nets, and it would occasionally be tied and untied. Let's see Rashi's explanation of what was wrong with the tying and the untying. Kishimatiroi, when you untie the strand, nira haneke b'yiriya shechotea hayu kfulim shisha v'hayu gasin. Suffice it to say, by tying and untying, it becomes very sloppy, and the strings were precise with different colors and fibers and a certain thickness. And any kind of manipulation or tying or untying, that would be sloppy work. And because it was so essential to get it right the first time, they would be very meticulous. Basically, they would have to make sure preemptively to make sure that there isn't a duplicate of a strand so that it wouldn't have this sloppy look, and they would try to get it right. I want to give an example that really predates my being, which is I suspect that when one would work with a typewriter, although there was the ability to delete or to not delete, to cross out or whatever, but probably an important document that needed to be submitted, you'd probably retype it or whatever to get it right. You wouldn't want to have it all messy. Although if you're taking notes for yourself or an internal document, you might not be afraid to do so. So that kind of work product, the kind of excellence that the craftsmen who are constructing the Mishkan would demand of themselves, would therefore ensure that such tying and untying in the sloppy manner would not exist. Now let's see a final Rashi or two. Sadeh chilazin, those that would trap the chilazin. As we mentioned when we read the Mishnah, chilazin is the matter of of an intense debate. 3 opinions. Opinion A, we don't know what a chilazin is. Opinion B, it's a cuttlefish. That was the opinion of the Radziner in Poland in the 1800s and 1900s. Tragically, and the third opinion, which is, I think, the most scientifically supported, and there are a lot of proponents today, is that it is actually the Murex trunculus. Did I get it right? It's a kind of snail, an underwater snail that's hard to reach, but it's prevalent in Israel. And when they puncture it, when they puncture a certain gland, there's a certain small amount of secretion that, when exposed to sunlight, turns blue. And I believe that is probably the most prevalent of those who wear techeles. Certainly, I believe that is the more prevalent opinion, although I'm not an expert on this matter. And there also have been archaeological finds of large amounts of discarded shell of this fish from the time of the Beis Hamikdash, etc. But anyways, tzidei chilazin. Why would they want to catch this chilazin? Litzboya hatcheles b'damai. They would want to dye the techeles color with its blood. Let's see how Rashi. But I just want to say something. What I just said now, again, that's also not halacha l'maisa. I'm just telling you that in what I've sampled and surveyed and spoken to people, it seems like the third opinion is the most popular. You will find people, and maybe people on our group that are more educated than I am on this matter, that will tell me that I'm absolutely wrong. So I'm just sharing with you what I've heard. This is an area that I'm not qualified to take a position. What I will say is that this Gemara and the other Gemaras are used among other sources for each opinion, each position, to shore up their opinion on the matter of the identity of the chilazin. So let's see Rashi. Rashi says, what is a chilazin? They would dye the tcheles with the blood. I'm sorry, a chilazin is like a little fish. The oila, achas, the shivim, shana, and once in 70 years, these creatures would emerge from the water. They were very rare, hard to find, a very highly specialized job. So those who reject the opinion that says that the tcheles, the chilazin, was this Murex trunculus, this kind of underwater snail, would point to Rashi, who's really sourced in the Gemara, and say this description doesn't sound like a snail; it sounds like a dog katan, and that actually is used, I believe, by the Radziner Rebbe, a great Talmud Chacham, a great tzaddik. He would use this Gemara and this Rashi and others to prove that it would not be this snail, rather it would be some kind of fish. maybe a cuttlefish, and the others would say this doesn't sound like either. There's two opinions, and we'll need to wait for Eliyahu Navi and for Mashiach to come for us to know the identity of the tcheles. So, Kaishnu Matirin, why are they tying and untying? Nets are made of multiple knots. Then kishre kayama, they are permanent knots. But occasionally, you need to take apart a net to expand and attach it to another net. So, matir mikan v'koisher mikan. So there are circumstances where one does come to tie and untie, but otherwise, it is generally understood to be a permanent situation. And so, according to our Gemara, that's where we find tying and untying in the Mishkan. It was in the procurement of the pigment of the tcheles, where they would have to use the dyes. And of course, just to point out to you before we continue, there's an entire chapter devoted to knots. And so we'll have a lot more fun in another 20 pages or so, 25 pages of the Gemara. So have no fear. All of the items that we feel like we're rejecting, we'll be revisiting, and we'll have loads of fun with Hashem's help. And Tosfos here reminds us that there are some additional factors that the Gemara will discuss later on in the Masechta. Let's just see. All right, not for now. All right, let's go to the next Gemara. It's an interesting Gemara. We might find the source to a very prevalent word in the English language. At least that's my understanding. We'll see. Hatoifer states firois. So now we finished talking about tying and untying, and now we're going to go on to the stitching and unstitching. So the Mishnah continues and says, Hatoifer states firois. When you make two stitches, you thread your needle twice, you make two stitches. That is another malacha, the malacha of tefira or toifer, and that's also prohibited. So the Gemara says, hold on a second. I know a thing or two about stitching, and two stitches in isolation is really not that much. And the odds of the two items, two fabrics, the two materials that are stitched together with just two stitches, they're not going to hold just like that. So the Gemara says, V'ha loy kayama. It's not going to withstand the test of time. It's going to immediately come apart. Rashi, loy kaima hachi. It's not going to endure just like this. And if it's not a matter of permanence, let's not consider this a malacha. And the Gemara actually accepts his challenge and needs to add, Amar Rabba bar Chana bar Yechanan. Therefore, Rabba bar Chana, quoting Rav Yechanan, adds, V'hu shekashran. Two stitches are a problem, assuming you also made a knot afterwards to cape it, right? Because I believe the manner of sewing in general, under most circumstances anyways, is that when you finish your series of stitches, you'll loop it in a way that there'll be a knot so that it doesn't come out.
Well, in that case, even one stitch, if you tie the one stitch together, will be permanent.
No, so there might be a problem. So maybe there's a problem with kshira, with tying, but as far as the subject of sewing.
Well, there are two issues here. One is the tying, one is the kesher,
Right, so
and one is the tefira. So if it says that the minimum tefira is 2,
right,
then it's considered tefira. But that's only because you tie it. Only then it becomes tefira. Then one tefer theoretically would also become permanent once you tie it.
So that's an interesting point. I hear you. The Gemara doesn't take that position, right? The question, I suppose, that what you're really asking is why. And maybe once
if it's the tying, if it's the kesher that makes it permanent, then it doesn't have to be 2 tefahim.
No.
Then one tefer is enough to make it permanent.
As with all the malachas, there's a certain shear, a certain measure. I understand what you're saying. You're saying if all you need is one stitch, and you do that one stitch, and you tie it, it should count for
right.
For
because the tefira, the two of them, what makes it a permanent, what makes it a malacha, is the fact that he ties it together. That is the end. That act makes it a tefira. The act of the kesher makes it a tefira. So therefore, why is it necessary to have two tefillos? One tefer is enough, because if you kosher, the one tefer would actually constitute it a permanent and would make it a malacha. Why do you have to make two? I mean, if there were two separate, I understand you need two tefillos to make it a malacha. But if the kesher was not involved, but once you involve the kesher to make it a malacha, then one would be enough.
You're asking a good question. I don't know the answer to it. I have a feeling if we had a person on the call that stitches frequently, they might have something substantive to add. What I can say without understanding the answer to your question is that in general, just like we said with eating or preparing food, although you've done the work, but under a certain volume, it's not considered. Well, tefillah too, to be considered a substantial sewing, apparently the Gemara understands it to be two, but you're making a good case. Usually, in other words, here's what you're saying. Why is one stitch not enough and two stitches enough? Well, we imagine because it's permanent. But now that you tell me that it's not going to withstand the test of time unless there's also a knot. So then just call tefer one stitch and one knot. That's what you're essentially saying.
Correct.
So that's a good question. I have a feeling it's discussed. I haven't seen that in my brief perusal of the commentaries. Let's actually look over here 1 second. Let's see. This would be more of an Achron kind of discussion. But no, let's see. Maybe the Ramban will give us some words. Let's see. Well, the Ramban actually says interesting. The knot that you're making is not a halachic. It's not a biblically prohibited knot. All right, it's a good question. The question stands. It's a good question, and maybe we'll be zocha to see further comments on that. Any other theories?
I think that I find it interesting. It's not a question, but an observation that the issue of permanence is considered to be an important factor. When the rabbi were considering the permissibility of computer display, the issue of the fact that the letters on the display are not permanent was also considered. But the decision was nevertheless to reject the allowance of displaying the name of Hashem on the computer screen, even for a flicking period of time. If I'm not mistaken.
So I'll just add, I don't think every melacha has the same criteria of permanence. I think certain melachas, their end product is intended to be permanent. So for example, stitch sewing. The whole objective of sewing is attaching two pieces of fabric that are distant. Temporary stitching doesn't deliver the goods that sewing needs or it intends to deliver. So for that reason, it's possible. I'm not saying it's possible that there's a distinction between, let's say, fire, right? Mavir. Even if we don't say about fire, you'll have to light a fire if it's going to go out. So again, without doing too deep of a dive, because I think it needs a lot of deliberation. But I guess we can just say like this: a malacha such as tefillah, which is intended to be permanent, to count, it has to have a degree of permanence. I will just tell you that a lot of the commentaries say only 2 stitches need a knot. 3 stitches already is going to last enough that even without a knot, it would be a chayav. I don't recall where I saw this, but it's one of the basic mefarshim.
The whole Mishkan does not have permanence to it. It's a structure that's not a permanent structure.
Hold on, the structure isn't permanent, but
I mean,
the Uriot were permanently.
The parts of the Mishkan are permanent.
Right.
But the idea of the Mishkan, the concept of the Mishkan, is the impermanent of the structure. The fact that they took it apart and then eventually needed a permanent structure.
Yeah. Interesting. Very interesting. Shkoyach. So we have a lot of food for thought here that remain on our plates. Let us do just one My mouse is not working. All right, here. Here we go. We finished for now. We're going to revisit a lot in a few pages or in 20 pages in a chapter or two. We're going to revisit the whole knotting and unknotting and stitching as well, bariches. So it's likely that the areas that we leave wanting now will receive plenty of attention later. And that actually is why I think some, well, anyways, we'll see. Next malacha, hakoira al-kareya al-manas litfor. A tear which is preparing to be able to sew. And if you look at Rabbi Steinsaltz's translation, he defines the word litfor as 2 stitches, which is interesting too. Kriya b'mishkan hava, mi hava. Is there indeed stitch tearing in the Mishkan? That doesn't sound like the right cutting. I understand, right? That's precision. What else? Tearing? When are you tearing? In the context of stitching and tearing. Rabba and Rabbi Zera Dami Tarvaya. So we're going to have 2 rabbis that both say the same explanation. Sometimes it happens. Sheken Yiriya Shenafal Ba Darna. You have a Yiriya curtain, as Rabbi Steinsaltz says, that has in it a Darna, a worm, that makes a hole. Rashi Toilas Umenakev Bonekav Katan Va'agol. It's a kind of worm that could happen, and it makes a round hole. If you want to stitch up the hole in a way that you won't notice, you need to sometimes expand the tear and then fold over the seam so that you don't notice. Because if you just stitch it together, the whole material becomes all wrinkled. And as we mentioned, the whole objective is to make everything look as perfect and pristine and enduring as possible. So you'll ask me a shaila. We said that when it comes to preparing the yiriyos, even one little knot is a problem, and here we're allowing them to stitch. Well, I guess the answer is that in the preparation, in the construction, it needs to be perfect. When reality sets in, we have to do the best job we can. So suffice it to say, it's plausible that in the maintenance of the Mishkan, you might have to do a tear the material so that you can restitch it in a way that won't look wrong, won't look bad. All right. Here's the fun part. And we're going to read this, and I think we're going to stop. We're going to just end a few minutes early here, but we'll see this Gemara, and we'll see, I believe, what I believe is very interesting. Amar Rav Zutra bar Tovia Amar Rav. Rav Zutra, son of Tovia, quoted Rav as teaching the following 3 halachas. 3 halachas that seemingly have nothing in common. Hamoteach chut shel tfira b'Shabbos chayiv chatas. If you tighten the threads of a stitch on Shabbos, that itself could make one chayiv chatas. Rashi. Beged hatafor v'oimet. A garment that has stitching in it. V'hiniach hachut ha'aruch. And the end of the thread is dangling off. It wasn't cut. V'nispardu shtei chatichos habeged zu mizu b'miktsas. And it became loose. So all the stitches are there, but it's somewhat apart. It's taut. And by pulling the loose string, it automatically zips up the shoelaces, if you will. It causes them all to go tight. Lahadik, and the effect is that it connects the 2 pieces of material. Although the stitches have already been inserted, because it's come loose, and because by yanking that loose string, it causes all of the threads to become tight and fuses the 2 pieces of material, or the 2 ends that we're seeking to attach as one, that's considered toifer, stitching, and one would be chayev echatas. Somewhat of a chiddush. You haven't done anything. All you've done is yanked at the string. You could be chayev echatas. Totally separate item. Haloimed davar echad min ha-magosh. Rabbi Menachem, is there a word magosh in modern Hebrew?
Just 1 second. Magosh. Depends. What does he mean here with the magosh? And
So I would be surprised if you told me there was, but that's why I wanted to hear from you.
what
So
does
let's
he?
see.
Yeah, let's see what the magosh means.
So we're gonna look at 3 resources. We're gonna look at Rashi. We're going to look at Rabbi Steinsaltz, and then I'm going to read to you a note in the Steinsaltz Gemara that's not printed in this text. And this is the item that I told you that I thought was interesting. Halomed davar echad min hamagosh. If you learn even one item from a magosh, and if you notice, Rabbi Steinsaltz doesn't translate the word magosh, but then he puts in the commentary, if you will, a Persian priest. Chayev misa. If you learn from a magosh, one could receive the death penalty. Let's see Rashi. Halomed davar echad min hamagosh. If you learn from a magosh, min. We're talking about a heretic. Hamamshichai la'avodah zara. Maybe we'll call it a missionary, a heretical missionary who's recruiting, and by learning from them, he will draw you to avodah zara. So here's the kicker: afilu devar Torah asur lilmoid mimeno. You're not even allowed to learn a word of Torah. So here's an interesting thing. I'm not saying this is exactly what Rashi's saying, but is one allowed to go to a Bible study with a practitioner of another faith that has our Torah as part of their what they call the Old Testament? Could you go to such a shir? So we might assume that would be okay. But our Rashi in this Gemara is saying that to go learn from a local priest, pastor, practitioner of again, I understand we might want to draw a distinction between Christianity and other faiths, but let's just broadly or loosely, one should not study Torah from a min, from a heretic. Pretty strong words of Rashi. But now I want to read for you what Rabbi Steinsaltz writes in his Gemara. He's not going to argue in the halacha that Rashi says, but he's going to give us another definition, which adds a very interesting.
We entered the definition of avodah zara. Then, what is considered avodah zara today?
Well, what's clear is at the time of the Mishnah,
the Rambam did not consider Islam
Christianity.
Well, it was always a question where you lived.
They say that the Sephardic Rishonim say that Christianity was not avodah zara, and the Ashkenazic Jews who live in Christendom said it is avodah zara.
Many times it also worked, yeah, but sometimes it was the opposite because they had to placate whoever wasn't in control of the land at the time.
Right. Well, also then Tosfos on the flip side, and we saw this a lot in Maseches avodah zara, tends to be a little more makel and lenient in practical, sticky circumstances where you might be borderline dealing with a Christian. Tosfos tends to be more lenient, and that's where I would say I think Rabbi Menachem, what you're saying, which is that Tosfos was on the ground, and they really had to work through each of these topics with a lot of difficulty. But on the flip side, sometimes the enemy that's close, or the dynamic that's close, you have a greater perspective. You might also say that the Rambam was exposed perhaps to other variations of Christianity, whereas Ashkenazic Jews were more exposed to Catholicism. But let's hold it there because but let's see Rabbi Steinsaltz. Magosh. So Magosh Rabbi Steinsaltz says, Magosh is describing a class of people from Persia called the Magi, or the Magi, M-A-G-I. Persian class of priests, which apparently descended from a Median tribe. Their prayers were intoned, they prayed, they davened in their ancient tongue. It wasn't understood by most people, including the Magi themselves. And they had a lot of mysterious ways, and people interpreted many of their mannerisms as sorcery, as witchcraft. There's actually a machlokes, as we'll see in a moment, between Rav and Shmuel, how exactly to treat the Magi. Were they simply practitioners of avodah zara, or were they sorcerers who applied witchcraft? What I find interesting is what is the etymology of our English word magic? Is it possible that the word Magi or Magi somehow plays a role in the word that ultimately develops to be the word magic? And I've seen elsewhere that it seems like there may have been a few different iterations of this tribe. They may have initially been more renowned for witchcraft, and then with time they became more known as spiritual avodah zara practitioners. Suffice it to say, again, the Gemara itself is going to argue, is Magi or Magi, is it avodah zara, or are they sorcerers? Both problems in the Jewish tradition, but the degree of the prohibition of being associated might vary if it's avodah zara versus sorcery. And then the last item over here, which again, seemingly totally apart from the other two, A person that has the capacity, he knows how to assess and study the stars, the constellations, and fails to do so, asur lisaper heimenu. You may not have a conversation with that person. What's so wrong with a person that chooses not to spend their time devoted to the analysis, the study of the constellations and the stars? What is the value in doing so? So the different Mefarshim have different explanations why exactly we would want somebody to spend their time. Suffice it to say, one of the complex matters of halacha is the calculations of astronomical calculations that relate to the Kiddush HaChodesh, the Jewish calendar, and other appropriate things. That's one explanation. There's another explanation that says that in the ancient world, many people that were well versed in astronomical calculations would be able to predict the appearance of comets and other, or comets, or how do you call it, or eclipses, and they would mislead people by saying, "Oh, I'm a prophet because I'm going to tell you there's going to be an astronomical event X, Y, and Z," and they could use that to manipulate the masses. And so another opinion says a scholar of the Torah who's able to make these calculations and therefore refute or make clear to the populace that these are predictable natural phenomena and not magic and other influences, well, to fail to do so is to not stand up to the moment and to what you can, the role you can play. So those are a few of the prevalent explanations here. Actually, another explanation which I saw, which is interesting, is that because astronomy or these calculations were not well known by many of the folks around, it would be an opportunity to make a Kiddush Hashem, being that the Jewish people had a repository of this information going back to ancient times, and they had the ability to show off the godless, the brilliance and the intelligence and the degree of information and education that Torah knowledge provides, so it would be an opportunity to make a Kiddush Hashem. It is interesting to note that in the medieval ages, well, first of all, the Rambam writes extensively on the laws of and about these kind of calculations. The Rambam also makes clear that the calculations that the Jewish people had in the time of the Sanhedrin were actually lost. And so the astronomical calculations he presents are based on the sciences of his day, and based on translations of Greek and other kinds of works. But suffice it to say, the Rambam considered those to be important subjects, and the Jews should know them, and it's part of halacha. So we're going to continue this Gemara Be'ezer Hashem tomorrow. But what would be the common denominator between all three of them? Well, there's two easy common denominators. Number one, they were all taught by Rav Zutra Bar Tavia, and so therefore that is enough to have them all mentioned in one breath, even though there doesn't appear to be much commonality between pulling the string and causing them all to come together, learning from a Magosh, and failing to be engaged in this area of the sciences. So Rashi says they were all taught by the same person, and that's why they're taught together. I saw, and I think we can actually come up to this on our own. Another chiddush here is each three of these issues are seemingly inconsequential. The stitching was done. All you're doing is tightening it. Why should it be a problem? This Magi is an educated person, and I'm having a shmooze about an interpretation in Tanakh. We're talking Torah. What's wrong with it? I know there's a lot of segments of Torah, so I choose not to spend my time on this obscure, abstract, and not well-paying a job. What's the big deal? And so each of these three things, although one would not suppose are a problem at all, ultimately, Rav Zutra Bar Tavia is saying you really got to step up and know what not to do, know what conversation not to have, and know when you should use your skills, knowing you should use your talent and your expertise in a good way. And as I mentioned before, many of the early folks of the new age of the study of the constellations and the discovery and the use of the telescope and the like, there were many Jewish Rishonim and who were involved in those processes. There were some famous Torah scholars, a famous rabbi who was a student of Columbus's navigator. Is that possible? Anyways, there's some rabbis, especially of the Sephardic world, that were highly educated in these spaces. And because Jews excelled in it, I believe, if you read about the New World, and particularly the early missions from Spain to Spain and Portuguese settlements to South America, Central America, and to the West Indies, there are many Jews that were involved in the navigation part, and that may have been at least somewhat an extension of this general desire for Jews to be well versed of these studies.
Jews were
The
also
good
very famous
example could be-
cartographers.
I'm
They
sorry.
were- Jews were also very famous cartographers. They were map makers.
Map makers, physicians. Jews were interested in the sciences perhaps more than their representation or more than their
Well,
side.
that was because they weren't allowed to own land
Couldn't own land.
and couldn't join any guild.
Yeah. Perhaps.
I think a good example could be the calendar computations that were made at the time of Hillel. They were impossible without astronomical observations. And nevertheless, they were pretty good from the point of view of modern science.
Right. I was listening recently, but I regret that I didn't take notes. I was listening to a podcast. It was just in the back of my head, but they were mentioning that there was a famous Torah scholar that was a famous student of, now I'm forgetting who, but some of the very big revolutionary scientists that trigger the beginning, the modern age of science. And so there are some rabbis that who developed the telescope, or who created the first. I should stop recording before I display my
Was it
horizons.
Copernicus?
Jewish.
Was it Copernicus?
Maybe Copernicus. I think he had one of his lead students was a Torah scholar who wrote commentaries. I believe so. And he describes Mori Verebi. He describes his science teacher in Hebrew as Mori Verebi, my teacher of the sciences. So I don't know. I may be getting it wrong, so I should probably stop recording. But interesting stuff.